When the news first broke that Hulk Hogan had passed away on July 24, 2025, it sent shockwaves through the wrestling world and far beyond. For decades, he had been one of the most recognizable figures in sports entertainment, a man whose fame reached far outside the squared circle. He was larger than life, immortal in the eyes of fans who grew up watching him flex his 24-inch pythons, drop his famous leg drop, and tell kids to say their prayers and take their vitamins. And yet, as the world began to mourn the loss of a wrestling icon, another story began to unfold, one that no one saw coming. It came not from reporters, not from insiders, but from his own son, Nick Hogan. Nick wasn't mourning in silence. Instead, in the days after his father's death, he began dropping quiet but powerful hints online. Hints that suggested there was far more to Hulk Hogan's final years than anyone had realized. Through cryptic captions, emotional photos, and heartfelt posts, Nick began piecing together a truth that painted a much darker picture than the one fans had been told. And when he finally spoke out directly, naming names and revealing details, the world was stunned. What he revealed was not just the story of a man who died too soon, but of a father betrayed, deceived, and isolated in ways that made his passing even more tragic. Nick's emotional tribute initially seemed like a son, simply honoring his father. He shared over 20 heartbreaking photos on Instagram, spanning from his childhood to more recent years, moments of laughter and bonding that seemed designed to show the world how much his dad had meant to him. But within that tribute were subtle clues, phrases, and details that, when pieced together, began to expose the devastating reality of Hogan's final chapter. Nick revealed that after years of living elsewhere, he had moved back to Florida, specifically to be close to his father. On the surface, that sounded like an act of love and reconnection. But in Nick's words, it became clear that it was also an act of desperation, an attempt to shield his father from the vultures he believed were circling. According to Nick, what he witnessed in those years was horrifying. He watched helplessly as the people his father trusted most turned their backs on him, isolated him, and slowly eroded what little peace he had left. He saw betrayal after betrayal, each one cutting deeper, each one leaving his father more alone. Perhaps the most painful of all was the estrangement of Hogan's daughter, Brooke. For years, the relationship between Hulk Hogan and Brooke had been complicated, filled with love but also with conflict. By 2025, that relationship had completely broken down. Brooke had cut off all contact, not just with her father but with both parents, citing what she described as years of verbal and mental abuse during her childhood that sometimes turned physical. The estrangement went even further. Brooke had secretly married in 2022 and given birth to twins in January 2025, monumental life moments that she chose not to share with either of her parents. For Hulk Hogan, who had once been so protective of his daughter that he famously refused to let her date, the absence was unbearable. To be denied the chance to walk his daughter down the aisle, to hold his grandchildren, to even know about their existence, it shattered him. Nick described how watching his father suffer through that heartbreak was one of the most agonizing parts of those years. It wasn't just about missing milestones, it was about the feeling of being erased from his daughter's life, of knowing she was out there but wanting nothing to do with him. But Brooke's estrangement was only one layer of the torment. Hogan's ex-wife Linda remained a looming presence in his life, even after their divorce had been finalized years earlier. In March 2025, just months before Hogan's death, Linda took to social media with emotional videos accusing him yet again of being a sex addict, a liar, and an abuser. She claimed she had given him everything and been left broken, without a sense of where she fit in the world. These accusations, though not new, reopened old wounds and reignited public scrutiny. For Hogan, it was another round of humiliation at a time when he was already fragile. For Nick, It was unbearable to watch his father be dragged publicly while he struggled with serious health problems behind closed doors. And those health problems were far worse than the public knew. In May 2025, Hogan underwent a major spinal fusion surgery. To outsiders, the surgery was downplayed, treated as just another procedure that the larger-than-life Hogan would bounce back from. But Nick knew the truth. The complications were severe. His father struggled with his vocal cords, making it difficult to speak. He had breathing issues, requiring medical interventions. He needed feeding tubes, a devastating sight for a man once seen as the embodiment of strength. Yet, while Nick watched his father suffer day after day, the world was told that Hogan was doing fine. That deception wasn't accidental. According to Nick, Hogan's inner circle, including his wife Sky Daly, longtime friend Jimmy Hart, and business partner Eric Bischoff, participated in a coordinated effort to conceal the truth. Publicly, they insisted that Hogan was strong, that he was doing great, that rumors of decline were exaggerated or outright false. But behind closed doors, Nick saw the suffering. He saw his father fading, weakened, and vulnerable. The most painful part wasn't just that people were lying, but that those lies prevented Hogan from receiving the outpouring of love and support he might have had in his final days. Instead of fans, friends, and fellow wrestlers rallying around him, he spent those last months in a kind of shadow, denied the dignity of honesty. And yet, ironically, the one person who tried to warn the world was someone with his own complicated history with Hogan. Bubba the Love Sponge, the very man who had once betrayed him in one of the darkest scandals of his life, began publicly claiming in June 2025 that Hogan's condition was far worse than anyone admitted. He said Hogan was in the ICU, on a ventilator, in a medically induced coma, and might not survive. His warnings were dismissed, labeled as lies, and countered by Hogan's inner circle, who doubled down on their message that Hogan was fine. But as Nick would later reveal, those warnings were far closer to the truth than the reassurances fans were fed. By the time Hogan suffered cardiac arrest on July 24, 2025, the charade could no longer be maintained. He died at Morton Plant Hospital in Clearwater Beach, Florida, at the age of 71. The official reports confirmed what Nick already knew. Hogan had been battling renal failure, severe COPD, and fluid overload. He had been intubated, cared for as best as possible, and ultimately brought home when there was nothing more doctors could do. When the wrestling community learned the truth after his passing, there was shock not just at the loss, but at the cover-up. The world had been denied the chance to say goodbye, and Hogan had been denied the dignity of honesty in his final days. The shock of Hogan's death was followed almost immediately by shock at the truths that began to surface. Fans, fellow wrestlers, and media personalities were blindsided. Even those who had followed his career for decades admitted they were caught completely off guard. Mick Foley, who had reconciled with Hogan after years of tension, described the news as surreal. He said Hogan was one of those figures you assumed would always be there, a man who didn't seem to age, someone too big, too iconic to ever fade. Dave Rubin's live reaction during a broadcast captured that same disbelief. As the news reached him in real time, his first response was confusion, followed by visible sadness, mirroring what millions of fans felt across the world. But for Nick Hogan, none of this came as a surprise. He had already lived through the betrayals, the lies, and the deceptions that had kept the public in the dark. And to truly understand why Nick felt compelled to expose what happened, you have to look back at the long pattern of betrayals that had marked his father's life, betrayals that Nick had been forced to witness up close. One of the darkest chapters came in the form of the infamous sex tape scandal, a story that would have been unbelievable if it weren't true. It began during one of the lowest points in Hogan's personal life, when his marriage to Linda Hogan was collapsing. The reality show Hogan Knows Best had already laid bare cracks in their family dynamic, and by 2007, the marriage was in ruins. Hogan was depressed, even suicidal, by his own later admission. And in those dark days, he leaned on someone he thought was a trusted friend, Tampa radio shock jock Bubba the Love Sponge. What began as a twisted form of comfort turned into one of the greatest betrayals of his life. Bubba encouraged Hogan to sleep with his wife, Heather Clem, framing it as therapy, a way to relieve stress during the divorce. Hogan later testified that Bubba pushed him into it multiple times. What Hogan didn't know was that hidden cameras had been set up in Bubba's home. Without his knowledge or consent, at least 3 separate encounters were recorded. Bubba himself sometimes entered the room, played music, and then left, while Heather Clem admitted later in deposition that she knew about the cameras but believed Hogan didn't. The footage was eventually stolen and leaked, culminating in Gawker Media publishing portions of it in 2012. The humiliation was indescribable. Hogan described feeling sick to his stomach, devastated that someone he considered a brother would betray him in such a way. The scandal didn't just expose his private life, it shattered his reputation. To make matters worse, the tapes included racist comments Hogan made in private conversation, remarks that led WWE to sever ties with him in 2015, scrubbing his name from merchandise, shows, and history books. For Nick Hogan, the scandal was devastating to watch unfold. His father's career, reputation, and even family relationships crumbled under the weight of the betrayal. Brooke Hogan defended her father at first, posting a heartfelt poem online, but the damage was lasting. Their relationship fractured further, part of the same pattern that eventually led to her total estrangement. The lawsuit against Gawker and the massive settlement that followed offered some vindication, but the emotional cost was immeasurable. Hogan would never again trust the way he once had, but the betrayals extended even further back, into his wrestling career itself. In the 1980s, Jesse Ventura tried to unionize wrestlers, an effort that could have changed the industry forever. But according to Ventura, it was Hogan who betrayed him, going directly to Vince McMahon and revealing the plan. McMahon himself confirmed it under oath years later. For Ventura, the betrayal was deeply personal. He and Hogan had once been friends, and yet Hogan's decision killed the union effort and ensured that McMahon retained complete control over his roster. To Ventura, Hogan's motivations were obvious. He was making more money than anyone else, even more than Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, and a union would have threatened that privileged position. This pattern of betrayal, both inflicted and endured, came to define Hogan's life. His affair with one of Brooke's close friends, which helped trigger his divorce from Linda, was another example of how trust and loyalty repeatedly broke down in his personal relationships. That divorce battle was brutal, public, and humiliating, with Linda ultimately walking away with most of their assets. For Nick, it meant growing up in the shadow of endless public scandals, watching his family disintegrate piece by piece. And yet, through it all, Nick remained loyal to his father. Even when others turned away, even when the scandals piled up, Nick stayed by his side. That loyalty is what made his revelations after Hogan's death so powerful. He wasn't speaking as an outsider with an agenda. He was speaking as a son who had carried the burden of watching his father's final years spiral into betrayal and lies. In Hogan's last interviews, there were glimpses of vulnerability that fans rarely saw. He admitted he wished he had chosen a different finishing move than the leg drop, reflecting on how decades of delivering it in poorly built rings had destroyed his spine. He talked openly about his struggles with painkillers, admitting how easy it had been to fall into addiction when doctors kept handing him prescriptions after each surgery. These moments showed a man who had been broken, not just by his body, but by the pressures and betrayals of his life. Nick's decision to reveal the truth after his father's death was not about tearing down Hogan's legacy, but about exposing what really happened. He wanted the world to understand that his father hadn't just died from health problems. He had been failed by those closest to him, deceived, and denied the honest goodbyes he deserved. And in doing so, Nick also highlighted a painful reality about fame and legacy. That sometimes the people who surround you when you're most vulnerable aren't there to protect you, but to protect their own interests. As tributes poured in from wrestlers, celebrities, politicians, and fans, the loss of Hulk Hogan was undeniable. But beneath the surface of those tributes lay Nick Hogan's revelations, reminders that the man the world saw as indestructible had in fact been destroyed long before his heart stopped beating. His story became not just about one man's rise and fall, but about the cost of betrayal, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the painful truth that even legends can be broken by those they love most. Hulk Hogan's legacy will forever be complicated. He was a hero to millions, a villain to some, and a man caught between the myth of Hulkamania and the reality of Terry Bollea. Nick Hogan's revelations have ensured that when history looks back on his father, it won't just see the colorful bandana, the iconic music, or the roaring crowds. It will also see the scars, the betrayals, and the tragic isolation that defined his final years. And perhaps, in telling that truth, Nick gave his father something he had been denied in life: honesty. So as fans continue to mourn and reflect, one truth remains clear. Behind the legend of Hulk Hogan was a man who lived and died surrounded by betrayal. And it was his son who made sure the world finally knew it.